welcome to the SureCloud podcast, everyone. I'm joined today by Hugh Raynor, who's our CloudSec lead here. We're going to cover everything today that's cloud security related, and it's a guide to cloud security ultimately. So Hugh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Avid listeners will recognise you, I'm sure, from other episodes, but for those who are new, could you just give a brief introduction to yourself and what your role is here?
Yeah, so I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant, and I currently lead the cloud testing team. So making sure that we're able to offer the best services we can in cloud, stay on top of current trends and things we're seeing in the industry, and just making sure that everything's secure in the cloud.
Awesome, nice. So tell me, what do we mean by cloud security? So what does it entail? What does it cover? And then we'll get into the details as we go along.
Yeah, so I guess the natural starting point there is, how does it differ from traditional security with on-prem infrastructure, and that largely comes down to what we call the shared responsibility model. So if everything's on-prem, you're then responsible for the physical security of the building it's in. You're responsible for maintaining the health of those servers, the performance, the security of all of that infrastructure. But with cloud, it breaks down into these two parts, right? We've got security of the cloud and security in the cloud. So your cloud service provider will, maintain and manage that security of the cloud. So that they run the data centers, right? You don't need to worry about who's got access to the cabs or anything like that, because the cloud service provider handles that. All that you need to worry about is the security in the cloud. So the resources you're deploying, you need to make sure that we're not just allowing reverse shells into our instances and things like that. So it offloads quite a lot of that responsibility. And the bits that you are responsible for, you've then got all of these hundreds of really valuable cloud provider tools and utilities to help you manage that yourself.
Okay, excellent. So essentially, we're outsourcing some parts of operations, right? So we're getting rid. Yeah, okay, good. That's good. So what's to stop me just throwing some things up there? Surely it sounds as easy as spin a web app up or spin some infrastructure up. Why can't I just do that? Can I do that perhaps?
I mean, you certainly can, and that's one of the big areas that organizations tend to struggle with the cloud. The ease of deployment there is really tantalizing to people. Quickly testing something out. Let's deploy a VM into the cloud, test it. Oh, okay, we forgot to take it down again after the testing. Oh, now it's been compromised, and suddenly someone's crypto mining from an Azure instance that they've compromised, and you're footing the bill.
Okay, cool. And then, so in terms of security, is the cloud more secure than on-prem? Is it less secure? Am I safe in the noise that I've put some stuff up there?
So again, in the cloud and of the cloud, security of the cloud, is pretty watertight, right? You know absolutely that everything's safe. With the environment itself, they're all accredited. They've got more security monitoring teams than you could shake a stick at. So you're never going to be able to compete yourself in that space. But of course, the internal resources yourself, that is managed by you, just the same as it would be if it was on premise. And you've also got a whole lot more configuration options. And obviously people have had tens of years now to get used to managing infrastructure on prem. A whole wealth of experience and known and understood processes, but it's only really the last decade or so that we've really been seeing a lot of cloud usage. So I guess the point there is that some people are still getting to grips with how to manage security in the cloud.
Excellent. Okay, cool. So can you talk me through what an effective strategy might look like for moving things to the cloud in a secure manner, of course?
Yeah, so I guess makes sense to look at the end goal, right, to define that strategy. And that's a secure environment where we're not seeing security incidents. And I think the most important thing that we can think of there is, well, the biggest quick win, I guess, is trying to minimize those misconfigurations. Because we have been for the previous few years, and we're still seeing misconfigurations as the number one sort of reason, or causation factor behind cloud security incidents. And so, informing that strategy, then things like change management processes. We see organizations typically having reasonably well-defined change management processes for on-prem infrastructure. Things have to be raised as a request, and they get signed off, and they get actioned, and that's all nicely logged. But again, as you mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, with it being so easy to rapidly deploy things, that then can lead to risk, right? So, you can deploy things, change a configuration of things really easily. You don't have to go down to a data center, plug into a console port and change settings like that. You can, from anywhere in the world, really, you can just sit down, go into your cloud provider portal and make changes. And that's really hard to keep on top of. And that's where these misconfigurations come in. So I think, the most important part of a cloud security strategy is managing that change, especially at the time of migration, right, where everything's happening all at once, making sure that, the environment's being set up in the way you expect and wish is really the most important thing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So tell me a little bit more about the governance. So what kind of governance framework do we need in place to make sure that this is done, in a secure manner, in a well-controlled manner? Ultimately, I think is what we're looking for. So, have you got any tips and information around that side of things as well?
Yeah. So, again, beauty of the many cloud service providers there are, you can really take your pick. Whether you think ISO 27001 is the best governance structure for your organization, or NIST CSF, these are sort of baked into the cloud service providers themselves. All of the, again, the cloud, the underlying infrastructure is all accredited to NIST, accredited to ISO, and then a lot of the tools and resources available in the cloud also help to streamline that process and point you in the right direction to making sure that we're managing these governance processes well. Azure even have I think it's just called Azure Governance, right? And that has a bunch of utilities within it to help you manage that process, like asset management and everything, just at the click of a button. Because we go into organizations regularly, and can I see your asset register? And it's about 12 different documents, none of them are complete. Glorious to be able to just have that at the touch of a button.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so a little bit into my comfort zone, or more of a comfort zone, so technical considerations. So let's have a chat about what you might expect to see if you were to do a penetration test of a cloud environment. What kind of issues are we seeing on the regular? And we talked about configuration problems, right? I'm assuming a configuration problem in the cloud is potentially a bad thing. So again, can you just give us a bit of an insight into what they look like, what the vulnerabilities might look like, and crucially, I think the impact. So we know full well that if you compromise a web app that sits in a DMZ in a traditional network, where you'll land. But if you compromise an application that's running in a cloud environment, what's your next steps? Where do you go from there? And I think it'd be good to kind of give a steer on what that looks like, if you could.
Yeah. So to go with your initial sort of question, identity and access management is a huge thing. That's different to traditional on-prem infrastructure. And that's a really important one to get right, and is an area that we commonly see misconfigured. Down to the simple things, right, like important root accounts and things like that, not having multi-factor authentication enabled, down to just misapplication of permissions and being overly permissive, so that people can deploy resources to accounts that have no need to, or interrogate other resources that are completely not related to the function that account needs to perform. So that's permissions and identity and access management is definitely the biggest thing. We also see sort of smaller misconfigurations that a lot of the time won't be critical, but they definitely have that potential. So things like unsecured S3 buckets. If you've got an S3 bucket that's publicly accessible, then depending on the data that's in that could be huge, or it could be it could be not really of any note. You sort of when these issues are compounded, okay, we've not set up S3 properly, then okay, we might also then have a lack of encryption in S3 as well. So suddenly then you've got data that's not encrypted, that's publicly accessible, and these issues they can quite easily compound themselves, and then well, you can imagine what happens if you've got publicly accessible data that's not secured, right?
Oh, for sure. And just so we're all clear, what is S3?
So S3 is AWS's service for unstructured data storage. So that can be anything you like. It could be JSON. It's just a data storage facility, and then it's got different tiers. So you've got like Glacier is more of a long-term S3 storage solution. So data that you want held, but you don't need to access. And it sort of progresses from there to data that is really expensive when you want to access it, but doesn't cost very much to maintain there, all the way back to the front where data's quite expensive to hold there, but it's relatively cheap to access.
Okay, so it's essentially a file server, right? And
yeah,
sounds like if it's misconfigured, it can just be out there for anyone to click on and access and get into. Okay, pretty scary stuff. So thanks you for that. I've heard about the Metadata API. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that is and why it might be a bit of a problem?
Yeah, so the Metadata API used to be more of an issue than it is now. So there are currently in AWS there are two versions. There's version 1 and version 2. Like most things, we'd suggest using version 2 or the latest version, right? The difference being with version 2, you now need to provide a token when you make a request for this metadata, whereas previously it would just provide you that metadata because you were able to make the request. Now, what would be stopping you from just making that request against any instance is that it's a special request to a non-routable IP address. And previously, the trust there was just if you could access this IP, then you were sort of implicitly trusted to be able to access that metadata file, which means if it was a web server or a web application running on that host, and you achieved server-side request forgery or any way of forcing that server to make a request to itself, or remote code execution, anything like that, really, you would then be able to query this metadata API. And I guess the crux of that is that it was a lot of data in here, including access keys for the environment. And the whole thing with the cloud, right, is everything is done on like keys and permissions. So getting these access keys, depending on the account that's in use there, could very well be the entire keys to the kingdom. Full access to that cloud account then.
Okay, and from experience, I've seen a few where the keys that you find are, the ones with a lot of permissions, i.e. the root account or something like that. Because I guess we touched on identity earlier on. Things like IAM exist within each of the cloud providers, or the main ones at least. But I'm not convinced that everyone's using them in necessarily the right manner and of the least privilege principle either. So
yeah, and I think good insights. Definitely the cloud is an area where principle of least privilege is hugely important, huge, complex, and definitely there aren't many organizations where one individual requires access to the whole thing. Typically the person that's deploying instances isn't also the person that needs to settle the invoice at the end of the month. So why would you allow one account to have permissions like that? And yeah, I mean, all of the cloud service providers tell you not to deploy to the primary root account or anything like that. But we do still see quite often resources being deployed with root, and then as you say, that one account then gets compromised, and that is game over.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a little bit more about cloud technology specifically. We've talked a little bit about vulnerabilities and implied that you might be able to run a web application there, for example, or some other services, for example. But let's talk about the technology itself. So what other things can you do in the cloud? So what's available to me if I signed up for an AWS account or an Azure account? What can I do ultimately?
Yeah, so well, almost anything you write, right? That involves computing. We've talked a lot about instances and virtual machines and things like that. But you've also got these whether you call them lambdas with AWS or functions with Azure. Serverless code execution where you get charged for the amount of time that your code is running. You can feasibly deploy a web application in a serverless manner. Of course, it's not serverless, right? It's just you're not maintaining that server. The server is not visible to you. Obviously, it still exists, and many companies are running entirely on this serverless architecture that then reduces your risk exposure and attack surface quite significantly as well. There's really not much that you can't deploy in the cloud anymore, and even some of the the tangential services like. So Amazon run AWS Inspector, so where you traditionally have your on-prem infrastructure and your vulnerability management process would be entirely separate to that, right? Your server's not going to help you look after itself. But Amazon have AWS Inspector, and that's their cloud native vulnerability assessment tool that will go into all of your resources and scan them for issues. So there's really a lot of benefit to the cloud in terms of these extra little bits that you can just plug in and add on.
Okay, good. So I'm getting the feeling that it's a good thing. So all the stuff you can do in there is a benefit to us and kind of the world moving forward ultimately. Let's talk a bit about how it's changed the traditional model. So we've covered a little bit there, but how do you think that the attitudes are changing in recent times versus what they might have done? You mentioned it earlier on that cloud is probably the last decade or something like that. How have those attitudes shifted over that period of time, do you think?
Yeah, I think initially people were concerned. Naturally for many organizations, their data is the value to that organization. So entrusting that to a third party is sort of slightly alien concept. How can we just let this random other company look after all of our stuff? And certainly there are still cases where it's not viable. If you're dealing with highly classified government data, for instance, that's not going to be permitted to be hosted in the cloud. But I think attitudes are generally shifting now, and people are realizing that Amazon, Google, Microsoft, these guys are perfectly qualified to look after our data, and they've already demonstrated the ridiculous uptime. Uptime well beyond that we could reasonably expect ourselves. Talking 9 nines of reliability there, and as time has gone on, relatively speaking, security incidents frequency is quite low as well. So all good things for building up trust there.
Yeah, for sure. Is there a risk though to over reliance on the cloud? I know there's been a few instances recently where kind of your favorite streaming video services have been offline, for example, because there's been an outage in a certain region of a cloud provider. Are we a bit too reliant on it, perhaps?
I think there are definitely elements of that. I'd argue that outages would be a lot more difficult to overcome if all of these, streaming services were hosting on-prem. I imagine they'd have far more frequent issues than using the cloud. But certainly we are seeing organizations now moving to multi-cloud setups, as they're now called, where you've got resources across all three of the main players, perhaps. Obviously, you can't link up availability zones and regions and things like that quite as easily. But certainly, just if you want to avoid having all of your eggs in one basket, to some extent, multi-cloud's a great option.
Okay, that sounds like a lot more effort ultimately, but potentially some benefits, I think, as well.
It is 100%. It's a lot more effort. It's down to an organization to determine whether the benefit they get from duplicating that effort is requirement in order to stave off that that last fraction of doubt over reliability. For the vast majority of cases, it won't be, but certainly for some people, and whether it's down to reliability or just the different utility offered by different cloud providers, there's many reasons why you might consider a multi-cloud environment. You might prefer AWS's Lambda implementation, but you really want to make use of Azure AD, for instance.
Yeah, I guess there's quite a lot of companies would be multi-cloud without realizing it. So they're probably using some form of O365. You mentioned there Azure AD, but probably also have a few things in Google Cloud or in AWS, for example, as well. So already off the bat, probably multi-cloud straight away.
I think, and obviously that touches on a really important thing as well, is these cloud service providers we've been talking about. They're infrastructure as a service, full fat cloud, right? But OneDrive, that's a cloud service. Slack is a cloud service. All of these things, YouTube, people putting videos on, it's still a cloud service, right? It's data storage, access, processing that happens outside of infrastructure you own. So all of these, even software as a service tools, they are still cloud providers, cloud solutions.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let's say hypothetically speaking, I'm going to start moving some things to the cloud because I've enjoyed this conversation and I think I can do it. Do I just manage the assets in the same way that I would if it was an on-prem thing? If it's on-prem AD versus Azure AD, do I just manage it in the same way? Do I adopt something differently? Is there a cultural element to how this stuff is put live and managed to do that effectively?
So in my mind, it's so much easier from the cloud. You're able to zoom out, get a really high level view. You can say, okay, resources of this type, we expect to do this. We want these policies applied. From a 10,000-foot view, you can say, okay, all of these should perform like this. All of these have these rule sets applied. And then you can, step back and make sure that all those policies are running on those resources. You don't have to, go down to them, plug in, inspect them yourselves, make sure that everything is running as you would expect, on an on-prem infrastructure environment.
I'm sold. So, tell me, Hugh, what are your top 3 things that I need to consider as I move into the cloud as part of a cloud strategy?
So your migration is key, right? That can be make or break. We are still seeing migration periods as being one of the highest risk points in time for organizations, especially where the migration is so big that we spend a significant amount of time in a hybrid on-prem cloud setup. I think a lot of the time people are thinking, okay, this is well segregated, everything's disconnected, there's no real route between our on-prem and our cloud. But even when you think they are, completely separate, it's really important that we're still treating those as one environment, because in a lot of cases they are sort of really closely intertwined, and attackers can, find their way between the two.
Okay, excellent. So to recap, then it's developing an effective cloud security strategy. So selecting where you're going to put the data. I guess making sure that everybody in the organization is on board with that strategy as well, ultimately. We talked quite extensively throughout this about secure configuration, making sure that you have done your due diligence on whether something's secure and is secure when you put it up there. And then also third, I think we talked a bit about the governance structures that you would need in place to manage this kind of stuff effectively, which is nice as well. Let's say hypothetically then again, I'm already partway through moving to the cloud, and I know for sure that there's 3 teams that have started to do something in AWS, and I've got a couple of other teams that are doing something in Google, but I've not really defined a company-wide strategy. How do I get them kind of pieces of the jigsaw brought back in and managed accordingly? How can I bring them into the framework?
So I think importantly there, we need to make sure that we get buy-in from those teams. Consult with those teams on what they're trying to achieve, why they're using the providers they're using, because it's no good us just coming along and enforcing some policy if it makes people's lives difficult, because they just won't comply with that. So yeah, really important to understand the needs of the teams you're working with. What are their drivers? And then you can work with them to help define the strategy and what that needs to look like moving forwards.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Can we just talk briefly a little bit about architecture? How important is good architecture within a cloud environment?
Yeah, just as important as with an on-premise environment, really. You've got a lot of potential with cloud. You can, deploy what would traditionally be quite expensive networking equipment in a virtualized manner, and really, have that full control over your network. But yeah, absolutely. If you are just considering moving to the cloud, it is definitely a good idea to sit down with a cloud architect or an engineer and make sure that we get this right from the start, because it can be really difficult to sort of unpick that and go backwards and rebuild things later when all these interdependencies between software and services are already established.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then also, I guess defensively as well, you want to be in a position where you know how things are configured, that they're all centrally auditing themselves and pushing things into the central security center in some cases, a security function in other platforms.
Yeah, and that's a crucial element, really. Making sure that within the organization you understand what all of the various security tools and utilities are doing. So quite often we'll see clients and they'll say, "Oh, everything should be fine because we've got CloudTrail and CloudWatch enabled." Well, great. That's going to tell you what's happening to your instances and to your resources. You'll be able to see who's modifying or changing them, but they won't give you the insight into what's happening in the resources, what's actually running on that resource, and what's happening inside that instance, which requires a separate solution. Maybe that's ingesting into a SIEM or a SOC or something like that.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your insights, Hugh. How can people find out a bit more if they've liked what they've heard today?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just type my name, I'll come up, or you feel free to send me an email.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, again, so I'm Nick Hayes. I'm on LinkedIn as well. You'll find me there if you want to search for us. SureCloud also hits us up there, and the podcast is available on all your favorite podcasting applications. Thank you very much, and see you next time.